Hello, everybody. My name is Damon Stanwell-Smith, and I am the Head of Science and Sustainability here at Viking Expeditions. And this evening, I am looking forward to talking with you and with our special guest, an ornithologist called James Lowen, who I'll introduce in a moment, all about the wildlife that we might be seeing in the Arctic and the Antarctic on Viking expeditions and in your travels. This is a Wanderlust Wednesday broadcast as part of Science and Ideas Week. And I hope if you've had a chance, you've already seen that on Monday the 5th, there was an opportunity to explore citizen science. And yesterday, on the 6th, there was a wonderful interview with the submariner Jim Delgado. And today, as with all things to do with expeditions, you get to meet extraordinary people. I am delighted to be able to introduce my friend and former colleague, James Lowen. And so welcome to Viking.TV, James.
Hello, Damon. Hello, everybody.
And I've got a long list, actually, to introduce James. He's quite the polymath. So I'll just a few highlights and I'll hand over to James. So first of all, James, you studied modern and medieval languages, I understand, at Cambridge University. You had an early part of your career in environmental policy. You've been a wilderness guide and a professional photographer. You've had a senior leadership role in the Environment Ministry, which is known as DEFRA in the UK government. And you've done wildlife research. And that's not all. I'm going to hand over, you can give how you've continued in your career.
Yeah, it's been quite a fun career so far, Damon. But in the last few years, I've made a particular thing of becoming a wildlife writer. I'm an author of 13 books so far. 2 of them have become prize winners. They've both won Travel Guide of the Year awards, and they're shown on the next slide, I think. And one of them is a brand new book that's all about, would you believe it, moths. So a creature that's certainly nothing to do with the Antarctic, although there are a few moths in the Arctic. So that's sort of, my career has sort of blossomed into engaging people about the nexus between wildlife, travel and conservation. And as part of that, talking to people and hopefully in the future, working with Viking too.
Well, that's fantastic. And as you say, moths, I think, have been underappreciated in the guidebook world up to now. So I look forward to finding out more about that, possibly beyond this conversation. And I'd like to add actually that James and I first met in 2006 when James was living in Buenos Aires in Argentina. As James's wife is a diplomat, so I think you're busy birding while she was maintaining British interests in South America. And you came aboard on an expedition vessel that I was working on, and we were so impressed with your photography and your wildlife competence and enthusiasm and skills then that we managed to persuade you to come back. And as you mentioned about Viking expeditions, just a little something that I'm extra pleased to share with our viewers is that I understand that you took a pledge with your wife that having become a parent 10 years ago, that for 10 years you'd take a hiatus of going to sea, and that your daughter is now 10. And I'm delighted that you've agreed that your future voyages you'll be one of our specialists, an ornithologist on board. And so for Viking viewers, what James is sharing with you now, in future voyages, we hope that you'll be able to bend his ear in person. So for the format for this conversation, we're going to discuss a series of regions. So it's not going to be exhaustive. When we're discussing the birds and the marine mammals and so on, I'll let James, who is the expert, share all the information, and then we'll transition from region to region. So if James, if you could highlight the map with the regions we're going to cover. Thank you very much. So you'll see that this is covering, if you like, in the footsteps of where Viking expedition vessels will be sailing. We're going to start looking at the bottom tip of South America, the wonderful Patagonia, and specifically Terra del Fuego and surrounds. And then we are going to be looking at the Antarctic Peninsula. And then as the ships will be migrating north at the end of the Antarctic season, so James will share some insight on the wildlife you might see as you sail north up the Atlantic seaboard of South America. And then we'll be looking at Northern Europe, specifically UK and Ireland and Norway. And we're going to finish in the high Arctic, crossing the Barents Sea and up to Svalbard and looking at the sort of European Arctic and Greenland. So I do hope you enjoy it. This is a live presentation, so if you think of questions as they're coming up, please don't hesitate to put them into the Viking.TV portal. I'll be able to see them and I'll pose them to James at the right moments. I'll try to intersperse a few in the conversation, and then after our conversation we'll have a question and answer session for all those questions we haven't yet got to. So if we're starting, let's bring up the map of Tierra del Fuego, and over to you, James.
Well, thank you very much, Damon. It's a real pleasure to talk to everyone tonight. And if we move on to the next slide, which shows roughly where our journey starts. So the gateway to Antarctica is in Tierra del Fuego. This is known as the uttermost part of the Earth. It's the southernmost area of mainland South America. And its southern edge of that mainland lines the Beagle Channel, so named after the HMS Beagle, the ship on which Charles Darwin sailed on an epic voyage that doubtless many of you will be familiar with. The city in which we start the itinerary is called Ushuaia. So if we move to the next slide here, we can see that. This is the southernmost city in the world, and there's plenty to explore around Ushuaia. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll have a look at some of the things you can do. So as you're waiting the day before the ship departs, you might wish to climb the mountain above the city of Ushuaia to visit the Marshall Glacier, which is what this snow is showing. Or perhaps head into very nearby Tierra del Fuego National Park and see some birds, which are shown in the next slide. There's lovely forests there, southern beech forests, austral beech forests, and there we can see fabulous birds such as the rather punk-crested Magellanic woodpecker, which is a huge bird. The male's on the left there with the red face and the staring white eye, and the female has got more blackish plumage. Other spectacular birds in this area, or noteworthy birds, include the austral parakeet, which is the southernmost parrot in the world. So no parrot extends further south in the world than this one. So it's a sort of record breaker, if you like. And if we head on to the next slide, we'll start our Antarctic cruise. And this is something that I've captured in one of my books, which is designed to be a visitor's guide to the exact area that we're going to cover in the first two segments of this show. So it takes you on a visit, just as I will do now, from the Beagle Channel through the Drake Passage and into the Antarctic Peninsula. And as you're getting onto the ship, the Viking ship, for the very first time, about to start your first ever Antarctic itinerary, you'll be very excited, but doubtless your eye will stray off ship, and off ship you may see wonderful birds such as the dolphin gull, which is a very attractive gull. And as the ship finally weighs anchor and heads out into the Beagle Channel, heading towards Antarctica, you'll be really excited, and there'll be wildlife to look for en route. So on the left-hand side of this photo, we see a predatory bird, a piratic bird called the Chilean skua, harassing a bird called an upland goose. And it does this because it has a fondness for the chicks of the goose. So it scares the adult away from the nest, and meanwhile its partner nips in and steals the chicks. It's not a great ending for the goose, but the skuas are fairly happy. The skua is a seabird, and that's like the other two species that are shown on this slide. So in the top right, there's a bird called the sooty shearwater, which in New Zealand is known as the mutton bird because it feeds and has fed for thousands of years indigenous Maori people. And indeed, they have a legal, they're allowed to take roughly 250,000 birds a year legally and harvest those for food. And we need to always bear in mind that what we may consider as a beautiful sight means something else to people in different parts of the world. Below that sooty shearwater, there is a bird called the southern giant petrel. This is more like a sort of, I don't know, it's a bully bird of the seabird world. It feeds on live and dead seabirds. It's a bit of a malevolent creature, I have to say, but no less spectacular for that. And as we continue to head along the Beagle Channel, where other things may catch our eye too, including the odd mammal. So there are a couple of islands in the Beagle Channel where southern sea lions breed, and these are really quite large creatures. Clearly, we're not going to have superb views of these species as we motor past them on the ship, but nevertheless, we should see a few, and they're interesting in their own right, because these sea lions, rather like the mutton birds I just mentioned, have been, or were at least, a key resource for the Yamana Indians of Tierra del Fuego for thousands of years. They used the sea lions for meat and for pelt and for hide for creating boats and things like that. That's definitely, seeing one of these is certainly a highlight of the Beagle Channel. But what we're all about is getting closer to Antarctica. So then we turn the corner of the Beagle Channel and we head alongside the southern tip of South America and into the Drake Passage, the fabled Drake Passage, which may be as calm as anything, or it may be rather stormy, but whatever, our Viking ship will see us proud and see us safely through the passage. And this means that we have unparalleled opportunities to see some really good wildlife. And although you've probably chosen this itinerary because you want to visit the Antarctic Peninsula, I would argue that the Drake Passage is not something to be missed. It's not something to stay in your cabin for. Instead, there are superb seabirds such as the black-browed albatross that I was just showing on the slide just there. And this is a species you may know from the ancient rhyme of the mariner, the wonderful poem, but it's a species that in conservation terms has suddenly gone from disaster to success. So many albatrosses were killed, having drowned on the long lines of fishing boats. But in the last 15 years or so, some technological improvements have been made to the way in which people fish, and that has resulted in a lot lower mortality of these seabirds. So the black-browed albatross was once considered really quite close to extinction, and in the last 5 or 10 years is now off the conservationist radar. It's a conservation success story. All is well and good with the black-browed albatross, and that's truly something to celebrate. If we go on to the next slide, we'll have a look at some of the other wonderful seabirds that you can see in the Drake Passage. Perhaps the most remarkable of which are the great albatrosses, particularly the wandering albatross. Now, these have the largest wingspan of any bird in the world, 3 to 3.5 meters. They fly effortlessly at great speed and strong winds, and indeed, scientists have worked out that the energy expenditure for an albatross when sailing in these winds is no different to sitting on the sea in calm conditions. So they expend virtually 0 calories, yet can travel vast distances. And by vast distances, I really do mean vast distances. The wandering albatross is really well named. One individual that was tagged with satellite was tracked covering 15,000 miles in just 2 months. And when airborne, it had an average speed of 34 miles an hour, which is roughly what I would do in a city in the UK, for example, if I were driving around. So that's pretty impressive stuff. But it's not my favorite albatross. That one comes up in the next slide. And that is a bird called the light-mantled albatross, which is a real stunner, really classy, a really special species. But there's plenty more seabirds besides. If we go on to the next slide, we can see sort of a size lineup, if you like, from the great wandering albatross, which is the largest bird in the photo on the left, right down to the tiny Wilson storm petrel that you can just about see in the bottom right of that left-hand picture. And the Wilson storm petrel is probably the most numerous seabird in the world. And the name petrel is thought to derive from St. Peter, who famously walked on water. And that's exactly what these little storm petrels do. They patter their little feet on water while feeding on surface invertebrate life. But birds aren't the only thing that we'll see in the Drake Passage, and it's really worth looking out for other creatures as well, other marine creatures. Amongst them are whales, and the classic whale in the Drake Passage is the fin whale. The Drake is fabulous for looking for whales, but only really when conditions are calm. Clearly, when it's very choppy, it's very hard to see the movement of whales through the water. But on a lovely calm day, you'll be able to see the whales and their blows, their spouts of water vapor from many miles away. So this is a fin whale. And it's a real treasure seeing the whales, because they're sort of reclaiming their marine territory, their oceanic former stomping grounds, if you like, having vanished for centuries due to commercial whaling. And now that that's largely, whaling's are largely a thing of the past, certainly commercial whaling, there's a great opportunity to see these. Other creatures you'll be looking out for, I've got a particular fondness for hourglass dolphins, which you can now see on your screen now. This is the southernmost dolphin in the world. No dolphin lives further south than these. Well, that's not quite true, as I'll show you later, but there's another species of dolphin that isn't called a dolphin. We'll have a look at that in a minute. Anyway, that should end our trip through the Drake Passage. So back to you, Damon.
Well, I was going to say, James, you've got us enthusing. And as you point out, that sense of anticipation when you get on board and head south is very much tempered by concerns about the Drake Passage, which in a capable vessel is always exciting rather than being concerning. And I can see the questions are coming flying in already. So that we have not so many at the end, I'm going to just pose one now, just that will set the scene a little. You're showing some fantastic images, and I know all these images are your own. And we have a question from David in St. Paul, and I think it's probably timely to ask this one now, as I hope it doesn't upset your flow too much about thinking about Antarctica. And the question is, what equipment or preparation should I consider for bird photography on the Antarctic Explorer expedition? And I thought maybe it'd be good to ask you this now because of all the other images that are coming up in this conversation.
It's a very good question, and it's certainly with modern camera technology, pretty much any camera can take photos of confined species such as penguins that we would see on the peninsula. But for bird photography, flying bird photography in particular, you generally need something with what's called a longer focal length, greater magnification, if you like. So a telephoto lens of around 400 millimeters or a zoom lens of between 100 and 400 would be a classic and relatively cost-effective piece of kit to have when coupled with a digital SLR camera. But if you don't have one of those, then bring whatever you've got, because there are modern cameras, bridge cameras, which are very good. Even your mobile phone can take some decent photos. Certainly something that would be unthinkable 10 years ago. You can now get some reasonably good images. But I mean, even better news perhaps is that Viking ships will have an onboard photographer who will be able to answer your queries, help you develop your photography in a way that someone like me never could. So, there's plenty to look forward to on board.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for that's question one of many, I can assure you, James. And if we now are heading further south, it's actually an area that, in my experience, is probably the one place where wildlife is sufficiently unfazed by human presence that you can get good photos with, as you say, with mobile phones. So we're now looking at the Antarctic Peninsula, which is where our Antarctic Explorer voyages head down to. This is the Northwest Peninsula, which is the most accessible part of the continent of Antarctica, and includes also the South Shetland Islands. So that's the main area. Again, I'm going to hand over now to James, who will give us a non-exhaustive but exciting run through of what you might be seeing there.
Thank you, Damon. I mean, excitement is absolutely the words. As you pass through the Drake Passage and reach the South Shetland Islands or the Antarctic Peninsula, the first thing you're looking for is snow and ice. So we've got a couple of scenery shots coming up now, which should show you some of the really exciting scenery you should see. Here, there's some large extent of sea ice. On the next slide, there's a huge towering iceberg. This is a glacier coming. Actually, it's a glacier coming down down off the continent. And if we flick onto the third slide in this little sequence, Icebergs. I personally can't get enough of icebergs because every single iceberg is different. You've got white ones, you've got ones that appear blue, you've got sculpted ones, you've got nicely graded ones, you've even got the odd jade one, which I genuinely don't understand. My brain can't get around how that appears. So the ice scenery is something to start with. But in terms of wildlife, what everyone really wants to see is their first penguin. And I'm going to show you a slide now of the very first penguin that my wife and I saw on our very first voyage to Antarctica as paying guests, as we were then. And this was on Deception Island, and we'd gone for which is in the South Shetlands. It's a classic landing on an Antarctic itinerary, and we got up on a hike sort of into the interior of the island, if you like. And from out of nowhere, we could hear a strange sound, and we had no idea what it was. And then from about half a mile away, we suddenly saw this chin-strapped penguin approaching, and it was obviously calling as if to a colony. But the colony didn't exist because they'd already gone out to sea, and it was lost. It just wanted to find its mates, its friends, and eventually it got closer and closer until this was the view that we had of it. And it just stayed there for about 2 minutes, allowed us, 50 arrayed, gawping Antarctic travellers to admire it, and then paddled off away down to the sea. And that was our first penguin. So you never forget your first penguin. It's a true delight. And if we move on to the next slide, it's a chin-strapped penguin is a species of bird that's particularly fond to me. This is probably my favourite image I've taken of a chin-strapped penguin, and so much so it adorns the front cover of the Antarctic wildlife book I showed you earlier. It's a very nice species indeed. It's the only one with this little well-named little black strap under its neck. And it's a very smart, if monochrome species, but offset with that lovely chestnutty brown eye. And here this pair is displaying to us, I think the male had just returned from fishing and returned to the nest site, and so the female was greeting it. It's a wonderfully intimate encounter with a truly precious species. But it's not the only penguin species around. So on the next two slides, we see gentoo penguins, which are very identifiable because of that lovely red bill and white bandana. It's the third largest penguin in Antarctica. And intriguingly, in November last year, some scientists argue that there's not one species of gentoo penguin, but there's actually 4, because they have isolated populations that are genetically and physically different, and perhaps even time their breeding seasons to match local weather conditions. And the analogy that was drawn was with giraffes, that in 2016 were decided upon as being several species of giraffes rather than just one. So these scientists say that gentoo penguins are the same. Now, the gentoo penguin population is increasing. It's increased to roughly 6-fold in recent decades, and is actually a species that is thought to benefit from climate change. And that's in stark contrast to the chin-strapped penguins that we showed you just a moment ago, whose populations are absolutely plummeting. And the same in terms of adverse impact is happening with our third penguin species, which is the Adelie penguin, which should appear on a slide round about now. And this is a species that is being pressed southwards due to climate change. It's a species that needs the fast ice on which to breed, so it occurs very far south of Antarctica. And it's also the only penguin that's named after a person. It's named after the wife of a French explorer called Jules de Moix d'Urville, who named it after his wife Adelie. That's very good. In my case, if I discovered a penguin, it'd be called Sharon's penguin. I'm not quite sure that's as evocative as a Adelie penguin, but I'll probably be berated later for saying that. In terms of penguins, there's so many ways you can enjoy them, and this is something I really suggest doing. We head on to the next slide. There are you just sit yourselves down with a penguin colony, sketch, photograph, admire, watch the behavior of just one pair of penguins and see what's going on there. If we move on to the next slide, we can see a whole host of experiences you can have with penguins, from calling, displaying, to mating. And then on the next slide, we can see them bringing up their offspring, so eggs that are hatching or raising chicks. And throughout the Antarctic season, no 1 month is the same. It's a really condensed period of time where life changes from week to week. So The penguins that you see in November will be doing something from the something different to the penguins you see in December or January. And in February, it's the end of the breeding season, and it's time to molt and then move out into the sea. So it's a really exciting time to visit Antarctica, to see all these different things happening. If we move on to the next slide, you can see, of course, penguins in locomotion. Now, penguins don't fly, but they can appear to fly by dint of their jumping or porpoising through the water. And then the final penguin slide is, I don't know if you know the film The Usual Suspects, but in the film The Usual Suspects, there's a lineup of the criminals. And this double-page spread from my book is sort of a play on that, if you like. It starts from the smallest Antarctic penguin on the left to the largest on the right. Now, not all of these penguins are particularly commonplace in Antarctica. You shouldn't expect to see more than 2 or 3 species in a typical voyage. But the one we all yearn to see, and sadly I have never seen, is the emperor penguin, which is the massive one over on the top right-hand side. And if that's not a reason to come back to Antarctica, I don't know what is. Okay, so if we move on, there's also other seabirds in Antarctica. This is one that often gets confused with penguins. This is the Antarctic shag, or the Antarctic cormorant. It's got a very similar black and white plumage to penguins, but crucially flies. And that is the diagnostic difference. If you see a penguin fly, either you've been frequenting the bath for a bit too long, or you're actually watching an Antarctic cormorant or Antarctic shag. Other seabirds you can expect to see on the next slide are species such as, in the top left-hand corner, Antarctic petrel. In the bottom left-hand corner, snow petrel. Snow petrels are a beautiful, almost dove-like seabird that nests further south in Antarctica and further south in the world than any other species. Even it's been seen at the South Pole, which is quite an impressive achievement. In the top right, we have a similarly white species called the snowy sheathbill. This, if you like, is the cleaner of the Antarctic world. It cleans up all the penguin poop and the sort of detritus around these colonies. The colonies are also frequented by the bird that's bottom right, which is sort of like a gangster in the Antarctic world. It's a skua, a brown skua. And these hang around penguin colonies waiting for a penguin parent to look the other way so they can nip in and grab an egg, or indeed a chick. So skuas are regarded as the gangsters of the penguin colonies. But it's not just about birds in Antarctica. There's plenty of mammals as well. And we'll start by looking at some of the seals that are in Antarctica. So on the left-hand side, we've got the Antarctic fur seal, which is really pleasingly recolonizing areas since commercial hunting of seals stopped, and is often a feature between January and March, particularly on the South Shetland Islands, where young males come across from South Georgia and spend the rest of the sort of summer period there. The rather uncouth individual top right sticking out his tongue is a southern elephant seal, and this was almost hunted to extinction in the 19th and 20th centuries, but is now back, even though commercial hunting only stopped 50 or so years ago. And this arrives in the South Shetland Islands from December onwards. Firstly, immatures, then females, then adult males come to the South Shetlands to molt. And the bottom right, that's probably my favourite Antarctic seal, which is the Weddell seal. It always looks happy when it's outside, out on land. It always seems to be smiling. And although it looks a little bit dopey when it's on land, it's quite the underwater athlete. It routinely dives to 500 meters depth for up to 15 minutes at a time. And the reason I really like this seal, its appearance is sort of, it belies a real sense of survival, this calm appearance, is that no seal occurs further south in Antarctica than the Weddell seal. It overwinters in the pack ice, and it survives by defending these breathing holes that it literally gnaws out with its teeth in the ice. So it's constantly going around and sort of nibbling away at the ice to keep the breathing hole open, which is fabulous when you've got workable teeth. But obviously over time, the process of keeping a breathing hole open wears away at the teeth until eventually they become no use for keeping that particular breathing hole open. At that point, sadly, it's game over for the Weddell seal. Anyway, there's one further seal that I'd like to talk to you about tonight. And this is probably the one that most excites every traveller to Antarctica, and that's the leopard seal. This is a voracious apex predator of Antarctica, whose diet is principally penguins, and indeed it hangs around penguin colonies, waiting to catch adult penguins as they come to and from the colony. And once it pursues them and it's caught them, it then it flays them from side to side in order to basically remove the skin and then consume the insides. And it's quite a scary animal, if you like, but there's obviously no risk for humans, and certainly not in the way that we would be observing them. It's more if you're a penguin, you've got to watch out. Other mammal species down in Antarctica that are worth looking out for are the whales. So you're quite likely to have an encounter, perhaps not so fortunate as this particular instance, with an Antarctic minke whale, or certainly more likely on the next slide, sort of the classic Antarctic whale species is the humpback whale, which particularly appears around the peninsula in sort of from December onwards. And the humpback whale has got one of the longest migrations of any mammal species, and the population that spends its summer in Antarctica moves north to winter in tropical Brazil. So that's quite a long migration, and with luck you should be able to see these around the peninsula from December onwards. So I'm going to finish our little Antarctic segment, if you like, with the apex whale predator in Antarctica, and this is the one I mentioned earlier. We're going to have one more dolphin that lives further south than the other, and this is because the killer whale isn't actually a whale; it's actually a whale killer, and it's actually a dolphin. And here in Antarctica, killer whales mainly eat seals, and really intriguingly, this is one of the things about Antarctica: no one really knows fully what's going on. Everyone who travels to Antarctica is, to a certain extent, an explorer. That there are different types of killer whales or orcas in Antarctica with different habits, different feeding preferences, and different markings. So in Antarctica, we have what's called the Type C orca, but in the Drake Passage, if you were lucky enough to see an orca there, it would be a Type B killer whale. So, no one really knows if there's more than one full species involved, whether evolution is happening in front of our eyes or not. But that's the joy of Antarctica. We don't know, and that's what makes every visit to Antarctica so exhilarating. Back to you, Damon.
Oh, James, a lovely run through of what might be seen. A couple of things spring to mind. Firstly, I think taxonomists are maybe not being as romantically descriptive as the old days, calling orcas Type B, Type C, Type D, and so on. I also, questions are flying in, and there's another couple I think that are contextual to the things you've just shared that I'd just like to raise with you. We have a question from Diane, who asks, what time of year do penguin chicks hatch? I'm excited to be heading to Antarctica in December, hoping for a relatively calm Drake Passage, and particularly since I was on the Viking Sky and challenging in March 2019. Specifically though, around penguin chick hatch times and being there around Christmas, do you have any reflections on when in the season the chicks are hatching?
It differs for each species. So Adelie penguin chicks tend to hatch slightly earlier, but around Christmas you should be seeing the first chinstrap penguin chicks hatch and the gentoo penguins as well. And so, I mean, literally you could be ashore and watching a penguin as it hatches from its egg. So I had that series of photos which showed precisely that moment, and that's truly special. You're not quite a midwife, but you certainly feel intimately connected with that particular penguin at that particular moment. So it's a joyous time to visit December. You'll have a wonderful trip.
Well, that's lovely. And then I have a question here I think even I can answer here. Is Terry from the US has asked, who on board these journeys will be helping to identify all the birds? Well, in short, we have a team of expedition specialists who include 6 naturalist guides, all of whom will be very familiar with the birds. And on top of that, we'll have always on every voyage a specialist ornithologist, someone, James or like James, who will be able to answer the questions in the same way I answer them now. So we're confident that at any time on a Viking voyage, you'll have the opportunity to have all the interpretation that we might need. So having enjoyed the Antarctic Peninsula, in terms of where the voyages go and also where we're going to take the conversation next, imagine now sailing north, heading up across the polar front, so from the Southern Ocean into the South Atlantic. And so the next area we're going to ask James to share his insights on are with the Falkland Islands, which are the islands just 350 miles, so about 500 kilometers east of the southern part of Argentina coast itself, and also the coast of Brazil. So have you some thoughts on those areas? And in fact, on this point, actually, I am aware that you're the editor of Near-Tropical Birding magazine, so I suspect this is an area very close to your heart.
Yes, it is indeed, Damon. So the near-tropical realm effectively covers from Middle or Central America southwards and it goes as far as the southern tip of Argentina and over to the Falklands as well. And the magazine is designed to help people get the most out of bird watching in that region in Central and South America. So absolutely, it's an area close to my heart. So if we head on to the next slide, if we're heading from the Antarctic Peninsula, we've got a wonderful sea journey ahead of us, where there'll be hopefully some more opportunities to view whales, albatrosses, there's another black-brown albatross and other seabirds. And then finally, we'll arrive in the Falkland Islands, and we come across sites such as in the next scene. This is a Lady Elizabeth shipwreck just off the coast in Port Stanley, which is the capital of the Falklands. And we'll have some opportunity to go ashore onto mainland Falklands, and there we've got a couple of easy excursions that are available for on the Viking trip itinerary, including seeing king penguins, which comes up on the next slide. So there's a local breeding population close to Port Stanley, or indeed plenty of other birds as well, including some of the interesting land birds, which somehow managed to make a living this far south. So here we've got small birds such as black-chinned siskin, which is on the left, the long-tailed meadowlark with the red breast on the right, and then the dark-faced ground tyrant in the bottom right. So these are all species that somehow eke out a living in what might be termed relatively hostile surroundings. Falkland is exciting, but it's time now to head back across the Atlantic and then to call in at Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. And Buenos Aires, it was my home for 3.5 years. It was where I met Damon, where I got into Antarctic exploration. But it's famous not for that, although personally, of course, it is, but for its tango dances, for its gaucho cowboys, which appear in the next slide, and for all the cattle that come with that. And Buenos Aires is probably the most exciting city in South America. It's a very vibrant place. It's really exciting. It's really a thrilling place to visit. But even in downtown Buenos Aires, there's plenty of wildlife to see. The best nature reserve in any city that I'm aware of in the world is right in downtown Buenos Aires, beneath the skyscrapers, and it holds 300 species of birds, several of which we can see here. The national bird of Argentina is the Rufus hornero, which is top left. The bird on the bottom right is the scarlet-headed blackbird, which is known as the Federal in Argentina, and that gives you an insight into a different way that you could spend your time in Buenos Aires. And then the ship will depart, and the next stage in the itinerary is to head further north along the Atlantic coast, and then to dock in Rio de Janeiro. And clearly, this is one of the most famous cities in the world. And it's an opportunity for, depending on which itinerary you've booked, to potentially do some post-trip excursions. So one might be to Iguazu Falls, the world-renowned Iguazu Falls, which is on the border between Argentina and Brazil, made famous by the film The Mission back in the 1980s, and a really spectacular place. Or you could even go further afield into Brazil and perhaps indulge yourself with what I consider to be the finest wildlife watching in the interior of South America, and that's in the Pantanal. And if we have a look at the next slide, the Pantanal in central Brazil, this is also a book I've written. It's the best place in the world to see jaguar, which is one of the most exciting carnivores in the world. So these are a couple of opportunities for sort of post-itinerary, post-Viking itinerary excursions. You can organise a trip to Guthrie, for example. But now I think, Damon, we'll head back into back into the Atlantic and head a bit further north.
Absolutely. And I can say that sitting here in my home office here in Cambridge and watching these, even though I've previously had the opportunity to see many of the places you're describing in the past, is just feeling so evocative. I can also say thank you to viewers. The questions are flying in. I think we're going to have a good session after this presentation covering things. But as James said, we would like to now take you north. So heading up into the North Atlantic now, crossing over, heading to the northeast up towards Northern Europe. And our Viking itinerary is certainly on the longer repositioning, the long oceanic voyages. We will head to the UK and Ireland, and then also to the Norwegian coast and heading up further north towards the Arctic. So, James, can you share some thoughts about what we might see around the UK, Irish and Norwegian coasts?
Absolutely, Damon. Let's have a look at the first slide, which shows a place called Inishmore in Ireland. And it's worth just me recapping and thinking back 10 years to when I moved back to the UK from Buenos Aires. And I've been really spoilt in South America and Antarctica. I'd seen so much wildlife that I really thought I was going to be bored when I returned to the British Isles, but not a bit of it. You know, Britain and Ireland have got so much wildlife to offer. It may not be quite as showy as some of the penguins, but there are whales and there are dolphins and there are seals. They're just different species. And so that prompted me to write a couple of books trying to encourage people to explore, or people in Britain in particular, to explore the riches of their own country. And we've got the opportunity on this section of the Viking itinerary to see some of the species and locations covered in that particular those particular books. So some of the iconic seabirds, for example, appear on the next slide. So in Ireland and in Scotland in particular, we're hoping to look for species such as the northern gannet, which is on the left-hand side. It's the largest seabird in Europe, and the Atlantic puffin on the right-hand side, a truly charismatic species with that ridiculous clown-like bill, but one that sadly, as a result of overfishing and the warming of the seas pushing its food offshore, is now threatened with global extinction. And what a tragedy that would be if a bird as iconic as the puffin were to go extinct. As we head up towards Norway, the itinerary covers a whole host of spectacular places along the coast. My favourite are the Lofoten Islands, a really, really charming little archipelago of beautiful places. And even as we, wherever we make a stop and we go ashore, there's always wildlife in some form to look at. So the birds that you might see on a walk on your local at a particular stop, if we head on to the next slide, include such sought-after northern European breeding species as the bluethroat, beautifully well named. It's a bit like the European robin. European robin, for those from North America, is nothing like the American robin, very different indeed, but the bluethroat's a beautiful species. And then top right, a finch called the brambling. This is the male with its lovely black and burnt orange combination. And below it, a white wagtail, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It wags its tail up and down. I love it for that. It's a beautifully energetic creature. Okay, if we head on to the next slide, I think we're back to you, Damon.
Yes. So I'm going to just also thank you for that little flying stop of UK and Norway. I have another question here it's actually from Janice, who's asked this from the Isle of Man, which is a independent, very independent place in the Irish Sea. And Janice asks, we saw frigate birds on a Viking cruise about 10 years ago. I saw one really close up, so there's no mistaking, flying along North Prom at Ramsey and the Isle of Man as well, so more than once. Any thoughts of how they got here? It was the summertime.
So there are occasional records of frigate birds, including from the Isle of Man. So Magnificent frigate bird and Ascension Island frigate bird have turned up as vagrants, if you like. And this is, they're very lost. They're not meant to be there. They're meant to be somewhere else. But seabirds, seabirds just wander. It's in their nature to explore, and there's a whole ocean for them to do so. So perhaps a wind has buffeted them in a direction they didn't want to go. Perhaps they failed as a breeder and want to explore somewhere else. Perhaps something else has happened. They've pursued prey in a different direction. But seabirds are renowned for doing this. Every year in the British Isles, there are seabirds which you wouldn't expect to see here that are suddenly found. So 2 years ago, there were species such as the brown booby, which should have been somewhere in the tropical mid-Atlantic, turning up 3 or 4 of them in the UK. So seabirds do strange things. It's a really good question and a really good sighting from you.
Well, I think that's very well taken. And of course, the more you watch, the more you see these interesting things. I think that for me is the take home of every time you go to an adventurous place, a remote place, and you actually watch and you realize that maybe wildlife documentaries that compartmentalize everything into a short, sharp view are just not, there's no substitute for the anomalous things that you might see just from spending a long time looking out at sea and looking in remote places. And if we go from Norway, we're now going to continue heading north. And so for our next section, we are heading into the northern realms, into the Arctic Ocean. And so we'll take, if you'd like to discuss your reflections on heading across the Barents Sea to Svalbard and maybe across to Greenland as well, that'd be lovely.
Yes, so thanks, Damon. So this is sort of the culmination of our whistle-stop tour of the Viking, Antarctic, Atlantic, and Arctic itineraries. So leaving Tromsø, we'd head across the Barents Sea, rather as you would crossing the Drake Passage on your Antarctic trip. And there's a whole host of wildlife available for those who've got sharp eyes, keen eyes. So we'll be looking for birds, seabirds such as the northern fulmar, which is top left here, and cetaceans, so whales and dolphins. We may well see humpback whales, which is the one showing its tail flukes in the top right. And how wonderful would it be if you've already seen humpback whales in Antarctica to see them up in the top of the northern hemisphere as well. There may be minke whales, a different species to the Antarctic minke whale, and there may be dolphins, such as white-sided dolphin. And as Damon sort of says, it's all about keeping your eyes looking out and being inquisitive, staying alert to a flicker of something that shouldn't really be there, and then using your binoculars or whatever optics you have available to enjoy these to the full. And as we cross the Barents Sea, one of the highlights is when we reach Bear Island, or Bornøya. And these seabird cliffs are like nothing on earth. They're steep cliffs beyond belief, and they're packed full of what we call auks in the UK, but which are called murres in North America, and sort of looking out for errant, inattentive individuals or inattentive kittiwakes, which are small gulls, is the bird top left, which is the apex predator of this area, which is the white-tailed eagle or sea eagle. And to see a sea eagle swoop down past one of these colonies of seabirds on Bear Island is an absolute trip highlight. There's no doubt about it. And then we finally reach Svalbard or Greenland, depending what the itinerary is undertaking. And the Arctic, people often ask me what the differences are between an Arctic experience and an Antarctic experience. I think it's fair to say that in the Arctic, the species you encounter tend to be more wary of humans. They've had a longer history of disturbance in a way that isn't the case in Antarctica. There tend to be, the exciting things don't tend to come as freely as they do in Antarctica. There's no real equivalent of penguin colonies, or we'll see a slight variant on that later. But the diversity of Arctic species is greater and is sort of underappreciated. You will see far more species of bird and probably mammal in the Arctic than you will in the Antarctic. So, these experiences aren't interchangeable. They're very different, and each has real treasures to offer. So let's have a look at some of those experiences now. And clearly, the mammal, the iconic mammal of the Arctic is the polar bear, and this is the creature that everyone wants to see. It's by no means guaranteed. Polar bears are very rare. There is probably no species for which the context is more important, and this is what this photo tries to communicate, that the polar bear is all about the pole, it's all about ice, it's all about glaciers, and because of climate change, sea ice is shrinking. With that, the kind of polar bear's livelihood is getting more difficult. It's harder for it to hunt, it's harder for it to live and raise its cubs. So there's no guarantee of seeing polar bear, but seeing one like this is really, really evocative. It'd be a life highlight, let alone a trip highlight. But there's other mammals. If you don't see polar bears, then there's plenty of other excitement to take your fancy. Anything from the reindeer that roam around Svalbard to the Arctic fox that is top right, that's looking for probably an inattentive parent goose whose chicks it wants to rob. And then, of course, the fabulous walruses that inhabit both Greenland and Svalbard, that's bottom left. And then a whole host of whales that are really, really resonate with the Arctic. Perhaps the most resonant of all is the white whale, is the beluga that is bottom right. So these are real star mammals that would hopefully form a part of an Arctic itinerary. Then we'll have a look at a couple of the birds, I think, as well. And it's really personally quite pleasing that in this land of ice, several of the star birds are white. So here we've got the glaucous gull, which is relatively common on the top left. We've got the ivory gull, which is definitely a birder's bucket list bird, if you like, on the right-hand side. Pure snow white creature, sort of the visual equivalent of the snow petrel that we saw in Antarctica. And then bottom left, even some of the small birds are white. So this is the appropriately named snow bunting that's trying to find insects in amongst the old skeleton of some unidentifiable whale. So it sort of brings the Arctic together really quite nicely. And if we move on to the next slide, this shows some of the sort of coastal area birds that you're quite likely to see. So we'll start on the right-hand side. We've got the red phalarope, which is top right, called the grey phalarope, bizarrely in British English, but the red phalarope appropriately in North American English. And this is a bird that does things in reverse from most bird species. So it's the male that looks after the chicks. It's the female that has multiple mates. She will mate with several males and leave the male to look after her offspring. Just below that, we've got a beautiful duck called the king eider, which is a really special, dramatically plumaged and patterned species. And below that, we've got a little wading bird called the purple sandpiper. You might just be able to see on your screen the coloured markings that have been affixed to the legs of this individual, and that's because it's a bird that's being studied by ornithologists to track its movements, not just around Svalbard, but throughout its life. So that those little coloured flags enable birdwatchers anywhere on this bird's itinerary to identify it and to report the sightings, and so that its life history can be chased. And in terms of life history, I'm not sure there's any species that's more impressive than the bird on the left-hand side of the image, which is the Arctic tern. A typical adult Arctic tern will migrate between the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's a daylightaholic. It just loves daylight. And a typical adult, through the course of its lifetime, will migrate the equivalent of flying from the Earth to the moon and back. I mean, that's quite something for a bird, and speaks volumes about the species. So we could end with that one, but I'm going to show you one final Arctic bird, which is sort of the equivalent, if you like, of the penguins in the south in Antarctica. This is the little auk, or the dovekie, and it, like the penguins, it nests in these huge, fairly remote colonies, generally up in the sides of cliffs. And it just goes to show that although there might be overall a lower density of wildlife in the Arctic compared to the Antarctic, you get these sudden rushes, these sudden congregations of feather that will make any trip absolutely worthwhile and utterly memorable. So I think that puts us for the Arctic as well, Damon. It's been a pretty good journey, hasn't it? Pretty good voyage.
Oh, that's wonderful, James. And as I see, I can see the questions continuing to come in. And you mentioned terns. I mean, they're also a favourite of mine. And we feel with Viking expedition vessels that the tern migration is so evocative of what it is to be an explorer, that there is elements of the tern migration actually woven into the design of the vessel. And we have a question here. I've got two questions that are clearly from ornithologists, I think. Martin from Guildford in the UK asks, I was wondering, how do you distinguish between a migratory Arctic tern and an Antarctic tern, especially if the latter doesn't yet have mature plumage? I'm not sure if that's a trick question, but your thoughts on that?
It's a very good question. So the only place you're likely to have the overlap is obviously in Antarctica, and there it's the Antarctic summer. So the adults of the Antarctic tern will be in their summer finery, whereas for the Arctic tern it's effectively winter, so they'll be in a kind of less expansive, they'll be in a dowdier plumage. The immatures, however, are far more difficult to tell apart. I've only seen one convincing Arctic tern in Antarctica, and that shows it is actually a lot rarer. A lot of the birds tend to frequent areas away from the Antarctic peninsula, so you don't see them that frequently. So probably 99 times out of 100, if not more, you'll be seeing an Antarctic tern in Antarctica. But no, Martin, that's a great question.
I guess if you've flown your 10,000 miles or so, you don't want to then get disturbed after your long migration. I've got a question from Jörn in Oslo, who says, thank you for showing fantastic Antarctic wildlife. My observation is that penguins fly through water. How does that compare to flying through air in terms of energy consumption and use of muscles? Thank you very much for your inspiring talk.
Ooh, that's
another tough one.
That's a physiological question that will be probably beyond me. But the point is that they are supremely adapted for life underwater. So such that flying underwater, if you like, is no more energy expansive than a fully winged, operationally winged bird flying through air. Otherwise, it would be counterproductive for the penguin to do that. It'd be better off being flightless. So I'm not sure of the physiological explanation for it, but whatever, it works. And to see penguins moving underwater, you can absolutely appreciate that. So another great question.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So as I mentioned, the questions are coming in. So after we've finished our conversation, we'll go to Q&A mode, if you like. But I do like to reflect on the lighter side of your career as well. And if you have any reflections or anecdotes of your long career working in wildlife observation and ornithology.
We could be here for many evenings if I did that. But I'll pick one story that probably is worth recounting, that relates to a blue whale that we saw on my wife and I very first trip as guests on board an Antarctic itinerary. And I spotted this ahead of the ship in the Gerlache Strait, and I was pretty sure it was a blue whale, because you can tell by its sort of very long front body and a very tiny dorsal fin. And I was taking pictures, and I was trying to call to one of the expedition staff and saying, I think I've got a blue whale here. I think I've got a blue whale here. And I didn't seem to be getting through. Either I wasn't being believed or wasn't being heard. But I was glad I took these photos, because I went up to the expedition leader at the end of the day when the expedition leader got wind of this. And that expedition leader, Damon, was you. And look on your face when I showed you those photos and you realized that the ship had just sailed past a blue whale and you hadn't been aware, was priceless. Absolutely wonderful. And I'm still sure to the day that's why you and your colleagues invited me to come back and work on the ship, because I'd spotted the blue whale and you hadn't.
Well, I feel undone. That's wonderful. And you're absolutely right. It is. I recall the time one doesn't normally sail past blue whales and then have to explain to the guests. But may I reassure everybody, on Viking expeditions, we are taking longer itineraries, taking it calmer, and we will be stopping it, of course. Inviting you and other specialists on board will reduce that opportunity of missing the blue whales. And actually, do you know, our director of expedition operations, who's based in Tromsø, or who's from Tromsø, I should say, has told me that there is excitement in the Norwegian press about the return of blue whales to Svalbard, which is new observations. So that's a bit of a teaser there, and we're very excited about that. And I guess it's against watch this space. We'll see if the patterns of migration and behavior are changing, and that if blue whales are heading to Svalbard, that will be one extra wonderful thing to be seeing there on future voyages. So I want to first of all thank you so much, James, for your wonderful explanations in this conversation, this presentation. And I'm going to say thank you twice, because what I'd like to do now is to go into our question and answer mode. I have lots of questions here that are coming up. I have a screen just to my left here for viewers who are wondering if I'm looking away from the camera. I will ask them in the order they've come in, and this is going to be a good test. This is like mastermind now. So we'll start with an easy, some more of a reflection. So firstly, Leslie in Sant Antonio has commented that Costanera do Sur is fabulous, highly recommended to all birders spending their time in Buenos Aires. So there's a fellow Buenos Aires enthusiast there.
Absolutely, it's the best urban nature reserve I've ever come across. It's a truly special place.
Oh, it's fantastic. You know, one of the other things that I recall from Buenos Aires is seeing lots of people walking their dogs in great packs.
Yeah, but it's not. They're not actually walking their own dogs. These are professional dog walkers walking fleets of dogs on behalf of people who live in flats who are unable to do it themselves. So that there's a viable business in dog walking, but the public parks of Buenos Aires are packed with these things.
Well, I know. I've never seen anything like it. It's remarkable. So okay, the next question is this is a question often asked, and I know it's going to be a tough one for you, James, but your candid thoughts here. Suzanne in Seattle in the US says, can you help me decide why I would select the Arctic or the Antarctic for, as she asks, a better experience? Gosh, that's like picking between your children, isn't it?
But I mean, that's a very good analogy, I have to say. I don't think you can choose between them. They're both wonderful in entirely different ways. I think if you had a particular passion in terms of wildlife, that might skew it one way or the other. Because if you want to see polar bear, you're not going to go to the Antarctic. If you want to see penguins, you're not going to go to the Arctic. So I think think of it in terms of those, what do I really want to see the most? And then focusing on that particular trip. That's probably what I would say. But you're not going to go wrong with either. I mean, they're both fantastic itineraries, both amazing places that we're so privileged to visit.
Absolutely. And I'd say don't pick between the two. Do one year and one another year. But it is that $1 million question. So Bill in Windsor in Canada asks, the picture of the sea lion in the Beagle Channel appeared to have fur-covered skin. Was this the case? Is this unusual for sea lions?
No, it's not. Sea lions do indeed have fur-covered skin, particularly in the males. They can be quite shaggy, if you like. It doesn't mean that they're fur seals. They are sea lions. It's just we tend to associate sea lions with being in the water, and at which point the pelage is sort of slick black and looks rather oily. You don't appreciate that it's fur, but it's the fur that keeps it warm. So yes, although it's a sea lion, it certainly still has fur.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Now there's a question here that I think I might be able to help with. So this is Karen in the US asks, in what month are the seas most calm to cross the Drake's Passage? Well, I guess James and I will both have a reflection on this. Certainly I've been privileged to cross the Drake's Passage well over 100 times, and there is no way you can predict. You can have adjacent voyages at different times of the year where it's, as you mentioned in the earlier part of our conversation, James, that sometimes it's the Drake Lake, very calm. Typically, there are very long swells because of the prevailing westerly winds. Occasionally, it can be stormy. And for all the months that expedition vessels are able to access the Antarctic Peninsula, so that's sort of typically if you like, from sort of late spring through to fall. So that's in the Australs, it's sort of November through to March, that window. There is no predictor, unless you know different, James. That's my reflection.
No, I absolutely. There's no predictor, but I mean, from a wildlife perspective, whatever conditions are, you make the most of it. So, as I said, in flat conditions, you're looking for cetaceans, looking for whales and dolphins, and in windy conditions, that's perfect for seabirds. They're in their element, and so there'll be albatrosses all the way around the ship. So, you know, whatever it is, there's something exciting to look at.
Absolutely. Next question. This is quite a big question, but maybe we might have some specific elements. So it's Jean or Jean in St. Louis, probably Jean in St. Louis in the US, asks, is there any wildlife becoming endangered in the Arctic and the Antarctic? Now, I know you touched upon a few in terms of some penguin species, but I guess it's a big question. But if you had any particular things that jump out in your mind's eye?
Yes, and pretty much all species in the world now are affected in some way by human activity, direct or indirect. And human activity is sort of indicted in the threat status of what are called the globally threatened birds and mammals of the world. And that can be indirect in terms of climate change, adaptations to climate change. So I mentioned the polar bear. So the polar bear clearly is threatened by the loss of sea ice. We have birds such as the Atlantic puffin that I mentioned that are having to fly further now to catch their fish because the fisheries industry has taken some of the fish that's closer to shore, and climate change has forced the remaining fish to be further away. So birds have to fly further to catch fewer fish to return home to their colonies to feed their young, which means they're able to raise fewer chicks. In Antarctica, there are fewer globally threatened species simply because the impact of human activity is not so acute. But nevertheless, I mentioned that the differing impact of climate change on three of the penguin species. So gentoo penguins, for whatever reason, benefiting from a slightly warming climate, they're moving north, their population is expanding. But chimney-shrike penguins going downhill, so moving figuratively south, and Adelie penguins moving literally south. They're forced further towards the South Pole because they need fast ice on which to breed. So yes, I mean, there's so many ways that conservationists are only just beginning to get to grips with how we are impacting the planet and what impact that has on the wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's as you point out, there are specific species that are visibly changing rapidly, and wildlife that is adapted to these more extreme and highly seasonal areas are going to be potentially that much more vulnerable when there is rapidity of change. And of course, we're observing that climate change is affecting in polar, or more visible in terms of the rate of change in Arctic and Antarctic areas. So I guess that is more predisposing as well. So the next question, I may be able to help with this one, I think, was Gwen asks, how many excursions off the ship are typically included in trips, and how many are offered each day? Well, on expedition vessels, Gwen, you'll be pleased to know that the vast majority of all activities are included in the voyage price. And there will be a broad swathe of activities for differing, multiple activities on every day. If it's a sea day, there'll be workshops, there'll be lectures, there'll be the sea viewing, as James is describing. And then once we're in the coastal areas and able to use all the different off-ship activities, the zodiacs, the ribs, the submersibles where possible, the kayaks, the science that's going to the field science that's going to go on with the survey rib. All of these activities, plus the lab activities, plus again presentations and workshops and things going on board vessel, all of these are included. And so every day will be a rich and enthusiastic and ways to keep you super occupied. Kim asks, how will the submarine be used to further endeavour of discovery and research? So good question, Kim. Again, this is one maybe I can help with. is that each of our 2 expedition vessels have 2 submersibles on board, and the submersibles will be having a very extensive diving plan. So wherever we're allowed to dive, we'll be diving, and they have a range. They can go down to 300 meters or 1,000 feet, and everybody on board will have the opportunity to go submersible diving with us. It's not an extra activity. And many of the places we're going, because there is relatively so little underwater research being undertaken, every dive will literally be a potential for a voyage of discovery. And so the records from every single dive will add to the data of the places that we're going to. So in its simplest form, it's a little bit like in other branches of science, where the records that were taken hundreds of years ago will be that much more relevant, and certainly below scuba depth. So below about 150 feet or about 45, 50 meters, in that realm beyond the scuba depth, it really is a black book. There have been very, very few dives. If you're interested in the submersible side, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I thought last night's Viking.TV interview with Jim Delgado was fascinating, as a very experienced submariner. And so as a roundabout way, Sam Kim, how will it further the endeavour of discovery? I think that of all the activities that we'll be doing, the submersible side, to me, will be a discovery every single time the submersible drops below the surface and has a look at the undersea realm. And we'll be talking about that on another Viking TV broadcast. Next question. Noel asks, we're going to Antarctica in February and we hope to go on the submersible under ice. Will we see any animal life under the ice? Just for clarity on that, in the time of February, the submersibles will not be diving under ice. It'll be open water. So certainly there'll be amazing wildlife, although the wildlife we've been discussing has been on the surface side for this broadcast. We'll for a future broadcast, we'll discuss the underwater and very colourful underwater creatures that you see in Antarctica, in contrast to the monochrome above the ice, above the surface. So just to be sure, they're saying that it won't be diving under ice, it'll be diving in Antarctic Southern Ocean waters. And will you see animal life? It is teeming with animal life. Unlike James, who has written many, many books, I have only ever produced one book. And that book was of underwater wildlife, and specifically the little benthic creatures that live. And the one thing that jumps out is that they are very, very colourful. So Noel, I'm delighted that you're going to the Antarctic in February, and I do hope you have wonderful dives. Our next question is a photographic question. Gary from Pikeville in the US asks, do you use a tripod for your photography? And thank you for your great presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. It's very kind of you to say that. Sometimes I used a tripod, sometimes I didn't use a tripod. Generally, use a tripod in conditions where the light is quite low. So it's quite poor light, and often when you're out in Antarctica, particularly given the length of daylight, you don't need a tripod because there's so much light around. I do remember once though taking a tripod onto a landing in Antarctica and putting it on the ground. Unfortunately, it was quite a windy day, and I had my camera on top of it with a very expensive lens on top of it, and it blew over and broke the lens in two. So there are disadvantages to having a tripod. I now carry the camera and the lens around my person wherever possible, because you don't really want to be lacking a camera or a lens at a crucial part of the itinerary. Well,
thank you very much. That's I guess it's yeah, long lenses do need steadying sometimes, don't they? So oh gosh, questions are flying in. So I will now ask, here we go. Anthony in the Villages in the US asks, if we take Viking's ocean cruise called South American and Chilean Fjords, Buenos Aires to Santiago in Valparaiso, instead of other expedition cruises, will we see many of the wildlife as we sail through the Drake? So for James, that itinerary runs around the bottom around Cape Horn, so down the seaboard around the west and then east. So of the birds that you were describing, I guess it's the ones in the first segment that you were mentioning are probably most likely. Is that right?
Yes. So quite a lot of the seabirds that I mentioned for the Drake Passage and the Beagle Channel, you certainly would see. And actually, you would see a whole host of other species as well. So there's this wonderful sort of movement of water up the west side of South America called the Humboldt Current, and that's very rich in terms of food for birds and mammals. And so there's a whole host of seabirds and some cetaceans which you will see there that you wouldn't see in the Drake Passage. So it'll be very exciting. The species contingent would partially overlap, but I think there may even be greater variety in that Chilean side. So it'll be a very exciting bird watching itinerary to follow.
No, thank you very much. Sorry, I was at the same time. I'm very bad at multitasking. I was reading these new questions coming in as you were reflecting on that voyage. So next question is from Gwen, who asks, what percentage of travellers are solo as opposed to couples? I think I can help on that. That certainly we can absolutely cater for solo travellers, although the majority, my understanding, I don't know the specific ratio, but the majority of those that are travelling on Viking voyages are travelling in couples or in groups of two. But certainly, absolutely, it's absolutely possible. I will pass that on though to our customer service team, who will be able to respond to you directly by email on that. So you'll get a response to that. There's some very nice comments here. I'm going to share with you, James, just to show that our viewers have been sharing their enthusiasm. So I'm very happy that these are coming in. That Linda in Roanoke has said, what a wonderful presentation. Loving learning about birds and animals. Hoping to go on a Viking cruise soon. So thank you, Linda. Louis in Wimbledon says, well done, James. And as a question, it's an interesting question here. This is probably a question you're often asked, James. It's Clifford in Round Rock in the US. Asks, during your years of travel, do you have one particular sighting or event that is most memorable, or conversely, one that has been the most disappointing?
Oh dear. So the disappointment, I confess, I tend to erase from my memory as soon as possible. I was once told by a famous nature writer in Britain, so British people may know the name Simon Barnes, but he said you can't write about an experience you didn't have. So you've got to have these experiences. So you tend to forget the ones you don't have. In terms of the most remarkable experience, I have to say that first penguin, the one that I showed you towards the start of the talk, is right up there. Because it's the whole anticipation, the sense of we're doing something that is so truly special, and an embodiment of that is creatures that live in a place that previously I have never conceived of, I have no conception of, and so to see that first, or to hear first that penguin, then to see it approach us and basically wave hello and then carry on its way. That was a truly memorable experience. It's one that I'm so glad that I caught with the camera, and it's been, part of me ever since. So I'd probably go for that one.
Fantastic. As you say, it's you can't write about what you haven't seen. That's a very wise point. I was going to say, Martin, you get this shows the interactive nature of our live sessions, which I do so much love. Martin has responded, thank you for my response to a question about terns. Excellent presentation, fabulous pictures. I now need to go back to see some more of the birds that James has showed. So thank you, Martin, for that response. Joy from Brownston Charter Township in the US says, hello, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I wanted to know if any of the birds in your presentation are on the endangered species, I assume the red listed. So I guess that's quite a nuanced question, but did any of the ones maybe aside from the penguins that you've already mentioned jump out as being, and I obviously mentioned the puffins as well?
So some of the seabirds that I showed were globally threatened. So the wandering albatrosses are globally threatened. The light-mantled albatross, I also showed in the drake, is near threatened. Up in the north, I showed the Atlantic puffin. That's globally threatened. The king eider is near threatened. So that's sort of on the cusp of being on the official red list of endangered species. So yes, there's quite a few, and it's particularly the seabirds in the southern oceans, in fact in the north as well, that are under threat. You know, we've been harvesting marine resources for many hundreds of years, and that changes things over time. And so not everything is as successful as a species as humans are.
Yeah, no, it's very good. I guess it's quite sad, isn't it? The more, maybe as your career progresses, if you show images of birds that if that question is asked and more end up on that list, that's an index of the challenges that we face in conservation, I suppose. I've got a few more comments here that Phil in Boston in the US asks, is there a way to share animal and bird pictures during voyages? It gives me great pleasure to share my pictures with onboard ornithologists during our trip up the Amazon and east coast of South America. Well, I can comment on that there will be sophisticated IT to enable image sharing. And of course, the technology improves year on year. But as James mentioned, there is a professional photographer on every expedition team. And one of their key roles will be the interaction with our guests about images that they may be taking and sharing, and images that guests are sharing, and it's a shared learning and also looking at the interesting things that will be seen. So that's a roundabout way of saying yes, there will be sharing opportunities. Next question is Doug in Cambridge in the UK, so somewhere close, probably equally locked down as me. Is this coastal voyage a repositioning voyage? Will it terminate in the UK? So depending on the voyages that when we take the vessels migrate, I like to think of it as oceanic migration. Repositioning feels it under describes what it is to have those wonderful long sea voyages to look at seabirds. Will it be terminating in the UK? There'll be a leg that I think one of the leg terminations is in Cork in Ireland rather than UK. I'm afraid I'm not absolutely 100% sure. So Doug, I'll ensure that our customer services team will send an email also to give you that feedback there as well. We've got more statements coming in thanking James for the wonderful presentation, and I'll share that as well. And Noel from Malibu has a question. We're going to Antarctica in February. Can Viking provide duplications of these amazing photos with the animals so we can better identify them? We went through the Drake Passage on another amazing Viking cruise. Can't wait to visit this awesome area. Fascinated by the foot penguins on the Falklands that we can view up close. Looking forward to seeing the ones in Antarctica. So there's two parts to there. I think the comment about your images and where they might be found, I guess it's easy for me to say than James, is to say James has a lovely Antarctic guide it's actually on Viking's recommended reading list. So that's one way to get these images, I guess. And then also on board there'll be extensive identification, support, interpretation, and of course on some voyages James will be there to help directly, and others there'll be other ornithologists who will also be able to advise. I don't know if you want to add to what Noel's question.
No, that's it. That's absolutely right. You won't leave any species unidentified, whether it's through book or through talking to the experts on the ship. Don't worry about that.
Fantastic. Well, I was going to say that right now there is lots of points coming in. All of them, the common theme, I can't read them all out actually, is to thank James for your insights and your and your ability to share just the excitement of and about the birds and the marine mammals. And then probably looking at the time, I think it's probably about time that we did call time on our question and answer. So I'm going to add to both the thanks that are coming in from our viewers. So thank you, James, for taking the time to share your insights and your expertise with us, and also thank the viewers. So thank you for taking the time. And James, if you have the last word.
Just to thank everyone, it's been an absolute pleasure sharing the wonderful excitement that wildlife can bring. There's so much world out there, there's so much nature out there, and Viking is a fabulous way of helping you experience it. So I do hope that you come on a Viking itinerary or two in the coming months or years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. So until next time.